The rhythmic click of Jessica Turner's heels echoed through the expansive glass-walled office at the top of Innovatech Solutions. She was the embodiment of success, CEO of one of the most promising tech companies, admired for her intelligence, determination, and business acumen. Yet at that moment, none of it mattered. Sitting behind her sleek mahogany desk, she stared at her reflection in the dark screen of her laptop. Her sharp hazel eyes, usually filled with confidence, now held a flicker of uncertainty. Would Ethan's family ever accept her for who she really was? Ethan Cooper was everything she had ever wanted in a partner: kind, intelligent, and completely unaffected by the wealth he was born into. But his parents, that was a different story. She had only met them briefly at a charity gala, where introductions had been polite but distant. Brenda and Edward Cooper exuded old money elegance, the kind that measured a person's worth not by their character, but by their lineage and bank account. She had felt their scrutinizing eyes assessing her, their subtle but unmistakable glances exchanged as they realized she wasn't from their world. Ethan had assured her that his parents would love her once they got to know her. But Jessica wasn't convinced. She had spent her entire life fighting for respect in a world that had tried to keep her out. And now, standing on the edge of a future with the man she loved, she found herself wondering, was she truly welcome in his family or merely tolerated? That's when the idea struck her. A reckless, brilliant, slightly insane idea. She would test them. Not as Jessica Turner, the powerful CEO, but as Jessica, the nameless housemaid. If she was going to pull this off, she needed to become someone entirely different. The next morning, she walked into an upscale salon in downtown Manhattan and asked for something drastic. An hour later, the sophisticated waves of her perfectly styled chestnut hair were gone, replaced with a simple, unremarkable ponytail. Her signature designer wardrobe, packed away in favor of plain jeans, cheap sneakers, and a generic beige cardigan that screamed invisible. Looking at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. No more polished CEO, no more power, just another worker. With a deep breath, she grabbed her duffel bag and headed toward the Cooper estate. The mansion was nothing short of breathtaking. The sprawling white estate sat atop acres of perfectly manicured gardens, the kind of home designed to impress anyone who approached its grand iron gates. Jessica tightened her grip on the strap of her bag as she walked up the stone driveway, keeping her head low. The moment she rang the doorbell, a tall, impeccably dressed woman answered. Brenda Cooper. Up close, Ethan's mother was even more intimidating. Her ice-blue eyes swept over Jessica with the efficiency of someone who had judged 1,000 people before breakfast. "You must be the new girl," Brenda said flatly, without even asking her name. "Follow me." No greeting, no introduction, just orders. Jessica bit the inside of her cheek and nodded. Game on. Brenda led her through the house, her heels clicking against the marble floors. The inside of the mansion was as lavish as she expected. Gold accents, high ceilings, and artwork that likely cost more than some people's homes. But there was something about it that felt cold, as if the wealth that surrounded them had sucked out any warmth a home should have. "I expect perfection," Brenda continued without looking back. "Uniforms are in the laundry room. Breakfast is served at 7 sharp. You are to be invisible, understood?" Jessica nodded. "Good." Brenda stopped suddenly and turned, her icy gaze locking onto Jessica. "Now, let's hope you last longer than the last one." With that, she walked away, leaving Jessica standing alone in the grand hallway. Before Jessica could even catch her breath, a soft voice spoke behind her. "You must be new here." Turning around, she saw a young woman, no older than 20, with kind brown eyes and an apron tied around her waist. "I'm Claire," she said with a small smile. Jessica forced a smile back. "Jessica." Claire tilted her head. Strange. The others didn't bother introducing themselves. Jessica's stomach tightened at the implication. The others? As the day went on, she saw it for herself. The household staff moved through the mansion like shadows, barely acknowledged by the people they served. Brenda barely looked at them unless she was barking an order. Edward Cooper, Ethan's father, ignored them completely, except when he wanted to remind someone of their mistakes. Jessica had expected the Coopers to be distant. What she hadn't expected was the sheer invisibility of the people who worked for them. By the end of the day, she was exhausted, not from the work itself, but from the suffocating atmosphere of the house. She had built a billion-dollar company from nothing, but standing in this house as a simple employee, she felt powerless in a way she hadn't in years. And the worst part? This was only the beginning. The next morning, Jessica woke up to the sharp chime of an alarm clock that wasn't hers. It took her a moment to remember where she was, not in her luxury penthouse wrapped in Egyptian cotton sheets, but in a tiny, windowless room in the servants' quarters of the Cooper mansion. The mattress was stiff, the air smelled faintly of detergent, and the only piece of decoration was a cheap wooden cross nailed above the bed, likely left behind by the last occupant. Claire was already awake, fastening her apron as she balanced a steaming cup of instant coffee in one hand. "Better get moving," she whispered. "If you're late for breakfast service, Mrs. Cooper will make your life hell." Jessica sat up, rubbing her eyes, trying to shake off the lingering stiffness in her limbs. She wasn't used to this. A part of her wondered if she had gone too far with this plan, but there was no turning back now. She dressed quickly in the uniform left for her, plain black slacks, a white button-up shirt, and a stiff apron that felt like a costume. She barely had time to tie her hair back before Claire pulled her into the bustling rhythm of the household. The kitchen was already alive with movement, the scent of fresh coffee and buttered toast filling the air. A middle-aged cook barked orders, while the other maids scurried to set the grand dining table. Jessica mimicked them, keeping her head down, focusing on the clatter of silverware and porcelain. "Eyes forward, no talking unless spoken to, and whatever you do, don't spill anything," Claire whispered as they approached the dining room. Jessica walked in, tray in hand, and caught sight of Brenda Cooper sitting at the head of the long table, skimming through the morning paper as if she were a queen at court. Across from her, Edward Cooper sipped his black coffee, looking utterly uninterested in his surroundings. Neither of them spared a glance at the staff moving around them. Jessica set down a glass of orange juice near Brenda's plate, careful not to make a sound. For a moment, she thought she had gone unnoticed. Then Brenda's voice cut through the air, cold and sharp. "Who let the new girl serve at the table?" Every muscle in Jessica's body tensed. She kept her eyes down, waiting for Claire to step in, but Brenda was already pushing her chair back, looking at her as if she were something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of her shoe. "Do you even know how to pour coffee properly?" Brenda asked, tapping a manicured nail against her cup. Jessica gritted her teeth, forcing herself to play the part. "Yes, ma'am." Brenda raised an eyebrow. "We'll see about that. Fill it." Jessica reached for the coffee pot, careful to steady her hands. It was a simple task, something she had done countless times in boardrooms and cafes, yet under Brenda's piercing gaze, it felt like a test she couldn't afford to fail. She poured. The rich, dark liquid filled the cup perfectly. Brenda made a sound of mild approval, but just as Jessica was about to step back, she heard the woman mutter under her breath, "At least this one isn't completely useless." The words hit harder than they should have. Jessica had spent years proving herself in a male-dominated industry, fighting to be taken seriously, building an empire with nothing but sheer willpower. And yet, standing here stripped of her status, she realized how effortlessly people like Brenda dismissed those beneath them. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to remain still, knowing that this was exactly why she was here. To see the truth. To feel it. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of Edward Cooper lowering his newspaper, his gaze flickering toward her for the briefest moment. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about it that unsettled her. She stepped back into the kitchen, heart pounding harder than it should have. Claire nudged her. "Well, how bad was it?" Jessica exhaled slowly. "She barely looked at me." Claire smirked. "Then you passed the first test." The morning routine continued, the staff moving in an endless cycle of serving, cleaning, and disappearing into the background. Jessica kept her head down, listening more than speaking, absorbing everything. By the time the afternoon lull arrived, she found herself scrubbing the already spotless marble counters in the kitchen, more out of an attempt to stay busy than necessity. She was still lost in thought when Claire leaned in. "You shouldn't get too comfortable," she whispered. Jessica glanced up. "What do you mean?" Claire hesitated, looking around before lowering her voice. "They don't keep the staff for long. Either you quit or you're fired for something ridiculous. The longest I've seen someone last here is 3 months. Jessica frowned. "Why do you stay?" Claire hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of the front door's opening silenced her. A new energy filled the house, subtle but unmistakable. She turned just in time to hear Brenda's voice carry through the foyer, filled with warmth that hadn't been there all morning. "Ethan, darling, you're finally home." The words sent a jolt through Jessica's spine. Ethan was back. She knew this moment would come, but nothing could have prepared her for it. Seconds later, she heard his voice, warm, familiar, and completely unaware of the fact that his girlfriend was standing in the kitchen, dressed as a maid. Her pulse quickened as footsteps approached. Claire nudged her again. "Come on. If Mrs. Cooper sees us standing around, she'll have our heads." Jessica barely heard her, because just beyond the doorway, Ethan Cooper was walking into the house, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman he loved was standing just feet away, hiding in plain sight. Jessica pressed herself against the cool marble countertop, her heart hammering against her ribs as Ethan's voice filled the house. He was close, too close. She gripped the rag in her hands, focusing on the damp fabric, trying to steady herself. This was the moment she had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. From her spot in the kitchen, she could hear the warmth in Brenda's voice as she greeted her son, a stark contrast to the cold, clipped tone she used with the staff. "You should have told us you were coming early, darling," Brenda gushed. "We would have had the staff prepare something special for your arrival." Ethan chuckled. "Mom, I don't need a grand reception every time I come home." Jessica closed her eyes for a second, letting the sound of his voice wash over her. It was maddening being so close to him, yet unable to reveal herself. She had spent years reading boardroom dynamics, deciphering hidden motives in competitors, yet she had never felt this exposed, this vulnerable. "Is Dad around?" Ethan asked. "In his office, as usual," Brenda sighed. "You know how he is. Always working, even when he doesn't need to." Jessica risked a glance toward the doorway just as Ethan stepped into view. Her breath caught in her throat. He looked effortlessly handsome, as always, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed casually in a navy button-up and jeans that somehow still made him look like he had stepped out of a luxury catalogue. His tousled dark blonde hair gave him an air of easy confidence, but it was his eyes, those deep, thoughtful blue eyes, that made her chest tighten. And then he turned in her direction. Jessica snapped her gaze down, busying herself with the counter. "Don't look at him, don't let him see your face." "New staff?" Ethan asked, his tone light but observant. Jessica's entire body tensed. "Yes," Brenda answered dismissively. "Not that it matters. They come and go." Jessica felt something hot rise in her chest at how easily Brenda dismissed her existence. But she forced herself to stay still, to blend into the background. Ethan, however, didn't walk away. Instead, he took a step closer. Jessica could feel his gaze lingering on her, as if something about her seemed familiar. She tightened her grip on the rag, willing herself to remain calm. "Hey," Ethan said, his voice softer now, directed at her. "What's your name?" Her throat went dry. Brenda scoffed. "Ethan, please. Why waste time learning their names? They never stay long enough to matter." There was an awkward silence. Jessica wanted to scream at Brenda's cruelty, but Ethan's next words stopped her. "That's a terrible thing to say, Mom." Jessica's head snapped up before she could stop herself. Ethan wasn't looking at Brenda anymore. He was looking at her. For a second, the world slowed. His brows furrowed slightly, as if something about her face tugged at his memory, but before he could dwell on it, Jessica lowered her gaze again. "Jessica," she said quickly, her voice softer than usual, hoping it would be enough to throw him off. "My name is Jessica." She could feel the weight of his stare, but then, to her relief, he smiled, a small, polite gesture, nothing more. "Nice to meet you, Jessica." and just like that, he turned away. Jessica let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That was too close. But as Ethan disappeared into the hallway, a new fear settled in her chest. He didn't recognize her now. But how long would it take before he did? Jessica spent the rest of the day walking on a razor's edge, acutely aware of every movement, every glance, every possible misstep that could expose her. The longer she remained in the mansion, the more she realized how easily the staff faded into the background, how the Coopers, except for Ethan, barely acknowledged their presence. And yet, Ethan had noticed her. Not enough to recognize her, but enough for something about her to seem familiar. She couldn't let that happen again. By dinner, the house had settled into its usual routine. Brenda and Edward dined in the grand hall while the staff ate quickly in the kitchen before returning to their endless list of chores. Jessica had spent most of the evening polishing silverware, avoiding both the Coopers and, most importantly, Ethan, but avoiding him was proving impossible. As she carried a tray of empty glasses back to the kitchen, she felt a presence behind her before she even turned. A warm, familiar voice broke the silence. "Jessica, right?" She nearly dropped the tray. Turning slowly, she found Ethan standing in the hallway, hands casually tucked into his pockets, his usual easygoing smile on his lips. Her heart pounded so loudly, she was sure he could hear it. Yes," she murmured, forcing herself to keep her gaze low. Ethan studied her for a moment, as if something about her was bothering him, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Then he gestured to the tray in her hands. "Need help with that?" She blinked. "What?" He chuckled. "The tray. You look like you're about to drop it." She gripped it tighter. "Because you startled me, Ethan. Because I am your girlfriend, and I'm standing right in front of you and you don't even realize it." "I've got it," she said quickly. "All right," he said, raising his hands in surrender. "Just thought I'd offer." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her again. "How long have you been working here?" Jessica hesitated. Lying to Ethan wasn't easy. It felt unnatural, like wearing shoes that didn't fit, but she had no choice. "A few days," she said. "Ah," he said, nodding. "That explains it." Her stomach tightened. "Explains what?" "You just seem different from the others." The words sent a chill down her spine. She forced a laugh. "Different how?" Ethan shrugged. "I don't know. Just different." He tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly, as if something about her should be obvious but wasn't. Then, with a small shake of his head, he sighed. "Well, anyway, welcome to the madness. My mom can be tough, but don't take it personally." Jessica swallowed hard. "Thanks," she muttered, turning toward the kitchen before she could say something that would give her away. As she disappeared through the door, she heard him say softly, almost to himself, "Have we met before?" She nearly tripped. This is going to be harder than I thought. Jessica barely slept that night. Ethan's words replayed in her head over and over again. Have we met before? He didn't know. He couldn't know. And yet, the way his eyes had lingered on her, the slight crease in his forehead as if his mind was trying to solve a puzzle he wasn't even aware of, it terrified her. She needed to be more careful. The next morning, she forced herself to slip further into her role, keeping her posture lower, her voice softer, moving through the house like the other staff, silent, efficient, unnoticed. If she wanted to see the true nature of the Coopers, she had to blend in better. But it was proving difficult because Ethan kept showing up. At breakfast, he strolled into the kitchen, casually leaning against the counter as the staff hurried around him. The others barely acknowledged him, but Jessica's hands shook slightly as she scrubbed a pan in the sink. "Hey, Jessica," he said, as if they were old acquaintances. She stiffened. Why was he talking to her again? "Morning," she muttered, without turning around. "How's the first week treating you?" he asked. She forced a neutral tone. "Fine." There was a pause, and then, to her horror, she felt him step closer. "You remind me of someone," he said, his voice quiet, thoughtful. Jessica's grip on the pan tightened. She needed to shut this down. "Lots of people say I have one of those faces," she said quickly, rinsing the pan and setting it aside. "I should get back to work." Ethan hesitated, as if debating whether to push further. Then, thankfully, he sighed. "All right, don't let my mum give you too much trouble." She didn't dare look at him as he walked away. Claire waited until he was out of earshot before whispering, "Okay, what was that?" Jessica turned, feigning confusion. "What?" Claire gave her a look. "Ethan never talks to the staff like that. He's nice, but he's never friendly. He barely notices us." Jessica swallowed. "Maybe he's just trying to be polite." Claire crossed her arms. "Or maybe he knows you." The words sent a jolt through Jessica's spine. She forced a laugh. "That's ridiculous." Claire didn't look convinced, but before she could push further, Brenda's voice rang through the house. "Jessica!" Jessica and Claire exchanged a glance. "Good luck," Claire muttered, slipping away. Jessica wiped her hands on her apron and stepped into the hallway where Brenda stood with a sour expression, arms crossed. "I need you to serve during lunch today," she said. Jessica frowned. "I thought staff weren't supposed to—" Brenda waved a hand dismissively. "We have guests and I need extra hands. Try not to embarrass yourself." Jessica clenched her jaw but nodded. As lunchtime approached, she braced herself. The guests arrived, 3 impeccably dressed women, all dripping in designer labels, their laughter high-pitched and rehearsed. They settled into their seats while Brenda played the gracious host, her voice syrupy sweet, a far cry from the sharp, condescending tone she used with the staff. Jessica moved carefully as she served, keeping her head down. The women barely looked at her, too engrossed in their conversation. That was until she heard Brenda's voice shift into something colder. "The problem with people these days," she said, swirling the wine in her glass, "is that they don't know their place anymore." Jessica's hand froze mid-pour. "Oh, I completely agree," one of the women chimed in. "Entitlement is everywhere. Even the help think they deserve more." Jessica gritted her teeth. Brenda sighed dramatically. "I swear the staff in this house is impossible to keep. They either expect to be treated like guests or they're completely incompetent. Honestly, I don't know why we even try." A sharp, bitter laugh bubbled in Jessica's chest, but she swallowed it down. Then one of the women gestured lazily toward Jessica. "What about you, dear? Do you plan to last longer than the others?" For the first time, the entire table turned to look at her. Jessica straightened, forcing herself to remain composed. She could feel Brenda's gaze burning into her, daring her to step out of line. And suddenly she was angry, not just at Brenda, but at all of them. The way they spoke about people as if they were disposable, the way they wore their wealth like armor, the way they had no idea what it was like to earn something. She could tear them apart in an instant. She could tell them exactly who she was, watch their smug expressions crumble as they realized the help they had been insulting was actually a woman who had built a billion-dollar empire with her own hands. But not yet. Instead, she offered a polite, measured smile. "I suppose that depends on how I'm treated, ma'am." The woman blinked, as if startled by the response. Brenda's expression darkened. Jessica turned and walked away before she could say something she'd regret. She didn't notice Ethan standing in the doorway, watching the exchange with narrowed eyes. A flicker of realization crossed his face. The way she spoke, the way she carried herself. And suddenly, he wasn't just wondering where he had seen her before. He was wondering who she really was. Jessica felt the tension in the air shift before she even turned the corner. She had spent the past few days carefully dodging suspicion, staying in the background, playing her role as the quiet, invisible housemaid. But something had changed. She could feel it. And when she looked up, she realized why. Ethan was watching her. He stood at the far end of the hallway, hands in his pockets, gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. His usual easygoing expression was gone, replaced by something sharper, more calculating. He knew. Or at least he was close to knowing. Jessica forced herself to keep walking, but before she could escape into the kitchen, his voice cut through the silence. "Stop." She froze. Slowly she turned to face him, keeping her expression carefully blank. Ethan took a step closer. "Who are you?" Her pulse pounded. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean." His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. He studied her, eyes scanning every inch of her face like he was piecing together a puzzle he should have solved long ago. "There's something off about you. You don't talk like the other staff. You don't move like them. And you—" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I know you." Jessica's fingers curled into her apron. She could feel the moment slipping through her fingers. She had two choices: keep lying and risk humiliating him when the truth inevitably came out, or tell him everything now. The weight of his gaze bore down on her, and suddenly she couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't keep up the act, not with him. Her voice came out softer than she expected. "Ethan." His entire body stiffened, and in that split second, she saw the realization crash over him like a tidal wave. His eyes widened, his breath hitched, and then, "Jessica." His voice was barely above a whisper. The silence stretched between them. His expression flickered between shock, disbelief, and something else, something raw. You're my Jessica," he breathed, like saying the words out loud would make sense of the impossible. "What the hell is going on?" Jessica swallowed, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I can explain." "Then do it," he demanded, his voice suddenly sharper. "Right now." She hesitated. This wasn't how she had planned to tell him. She had imagined having control over the situation, easing him into the truth, explaining her reasons carefully. But now, standing in the dimly lit hallway of his parents' mansion, with his piercing blue eyes locked onto hers like she was a stranger, the truth came tumbling out. "I needed to know," she said, voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "I needed to know who your family really was, how they treat people who aren't like them, how they would treat me if I wasn't Jessica Turner, CEO of Innovatech Solutions." Ethan's jaw clenched. "So you, what, decided to humiliate yourself? Humiliate me?" "It wasn't about humiliating anyone," she shot back. "It was about the truth." He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "You think this is truth? Lying to me? Sneaking into my house under a fake identity?" Jessica flinched, but she held her ground. "I wanted to believe your parents were different, Ethan, but they aren't. They don't see the people who work for them as human beings. They barely see them at all." Ethan exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers against his temples. "Jesus, Jessica. I don't know whether to be furious or impressed." Her lips twitched, but she didn't smile. "Maybe both?" He let out another breath, quieter this time, his anger slowly giving way to something more complicated. "You should have told me. I was afraid you wouldn't understand." Ethan's expression softened just slightly. "I don't know if I do. Not yet." He took another step closer, eyes searching hers. "But I do know one thing. You never do anything without a damn good reason." She nodded. "And you're different from them, Ethan. You're not like them." A long silence stretched between them before he finally spoke again, voice quieter now. "We need to tell them." Jessica tensed. "Ethan, they're going to find out one way or another, and I want to be the one to tell them." She studied his face, seeing the determination there. He wasn't angry anymore, at least, not just angry. He was ready to confront them, to stand by her. Jessica exhaled. "Okay." Ethan reached for her hand instinctively before realizing she was still in uniform. He hesitated, then let his fingers brush against hers just briefly before pulling away. "Let's go make some people very uncomfortable," he murmured. And together they walked toward the dining hall, ready to turn the entire Cooper world upside down. Jessica had faced ruthless investors, cutthroat business rivals, and high-stakes negotiations that could make or break a company. But nothing compared to walking into the grand dining hall of the Cooper estate, hand in hand with Ethan, knowing they were about to detonate a bomb in the middle of his family's perfect world. Brenda and Edward were seated at the long, polished mahogany table, sipping their wine, their conversation light and effortless. The air was thick with wealth and entitlement, the scent of roasted lamb and expensive red wine filling the space. Brenda barely glanced up when they entered. "Ethan, darling, you're just in time. I was telling your father about—" Her voice trailed off as she finally registered Jessica standing beside him. Her lips parted slightly, her brows drawing together. What is she doing here? Edward set his glass down, looking between them with mild interest. Ethan's grip on Jessica's hand tightened. We need to talk, Brenda scoffed. About what? Why the help is standing in my dining room like she belongs here? Jessica clenched her jaw, but before she could respond, Ethan spoke first. Because she does belong here, he said, his voice sharp, controlled. And she's not the help. She's Jessica Turner. The room fell into dead silence. Brenda blinked, clearly not understanding. What nonsense are you? Then realization dawned. Her face drained of color. Edward sat forward, his expression darkening. Excuse me? Jessica straightened, meeting their stunned gazes head-on. Surprise. Brenda shot up from her chair so quickly that her wine glass nearly toppled over. This is some kind of joke. Her laugh was sharp, forced. Tell me this is a joke, Ethan. It's not, Ethan said, his voice unwavering. Jessica came here to see who you really are when you think no one important is watching. Brenda's face twisted with fury. Who I really am? She turned to Jessica, her eyes blazing. You tricked us. You lied to us. Jessica crossed her arms. Did I? Or did I just give you the chance to show your true colors? Edward stood, his expression unreadable. This is ridiculous. Why would you go to such lengths? What were you trying to prove? Jessica's gaze didn't waver. I wanted to know if I was welcome in this family, not because I have money or power, but because of who I am. Brenda let out a bitter laugh. Oh, don't be dramatic. You were never unwelcome. Claire's voice rang out from behind them. Yes, she was. Jessica turned, surprised to see Claire standing in the doorway, her hands clenched into fists. The other household staff lingered behind her, hesitant but watching closely. Claire's voice was stronger now, more certain. She was unwelcome the same way all of us are. You don't see us as people. You don't even care about us. We're invisible to you unless we make a mistake. Brenda scoffed. That's absurd. It's the truth, Claire shot back. You treat us like we don't matter, like we don't have dreams or families or worth beyond serving you. For the first time, Edward looked uncomfortable. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but closed it again. Jessica stepped forward. For this house runs because of people like Claire, people you refuse to acknowledge. You preach ethics, Edward, but you don't practice them in your own home. Edward's jaw tensed. Brenda, however, was still burning with rage. I will not be lectured in my own home, she hissed. Ethan's voice cut through the tension. Then maybe it's time you listened. Brenda's eyes flashed to her son, betrayal written all over her face. You're taking her side? Ethan exhaled sharply. I'm taking the right side, Mom. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Edward finally spoke, his voice quieter, strained. I never realized... He looked at Claire, then at the others, as if seeing them for the first time. His gaze returned to Jessica. And if you hadn't done this, I never would have. Brenda turned to him, disbelief etched into every line of her face. Oh, please, you're not actually buying into this nonsense. Edward was silent. Brenda's expression hardened. I have nothing to apologize for. Ethan shook his head in disappointment. Then I guess we're done here. Brenda's mouth fell open slightly. What? Ethan turned to Jessica. Come on, we're leaving. Jessica hesitated, but when she saw the finality in his eyes, she knew he meant it. Brenda stared at her son as if for the first time she was realizing she was truly losing him. Fine, she snapped. Go. But don't expect to come crawling back when you realize what a mistake this is. Ethan didn't even look back. Edward, however, did. His expression unreadable, he met Jessica's gaze one last time before lowering his eyes and sinking back into his chair. Jessica took Claire's hand briefly, squeezing it. You deserve better than this place. Claire nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. And with that, Jessica and Ethan walked out of the mansion, leaving behind the crumbling illusion of the Cooper family's perfect world. The drive away from the Cooper estate was silent at first. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw tense, his thoughts a storm Jessica couldn't quite decipher. She sat beside him, staring out at the sprawling city lights in the distance, knowing that after tonight, nothing would ever be the same. Finally, Ethan exhaled sharply. "That was insane." Jessica let out a short, breathless laugh. "Yeah, it was." He shook his head. "I still can't believe you did that." She turned to him. "Are you angry?" He glanced at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "I don't know, maybe a little." He sighed. "But mostly I'm just trying to wrap my head around it." Jessica hesitated before saying, "I didn't do it to hurt you, Ethan. I did it because I needed to know." "I get that," he admitted. "But Jessica, my mother, she's never going to forgive this." Jessica arched an eyebrow. "Do you want her to?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then finally he said, "No, not if it means pretending she's not the person she just proved herself to be." Relief washed over her. He understood. They drove in silence again, but it wasn't heavy this time. It was thoughtful, full of unspoken things that no longer needed to be said. When they reached Jessica's penthouse, Ethan parked but didn't move to get out. Instead, he turned to her, studying her like he was still seeing her in a new light. "So," he said, "what happens now?" Jessica smiled slightly. "Now we move forward," he smirked. "That simple?" "Maybe not simple," she admitted, "but we're going to figure it out. Together." Ethan exhaled, nodding slowly. "Yeah, we will." She reached for his hand, and this time, he didn't hesitate. A few weeks later, Jessica stood in the lobby of Innovatech Solutions, watching as Claire took in the massive glass windows, the sleek, modern furniture, and the buzzing energy of the office. Claire turned to her, eyes wide. This is where you work?" Jessica grinned. "This is where you're going to work too, if you want it." Claire blinked. "Wait, what?" Jessica gestured toward a waiting HR representative. "I pulled some strings. There's a scholarship fund for employees looking to advance their careers. You'll start as an intern while you take business courses. And if you work hard..." Claire cut her off by throwing her arms around her. "Thank you," she whispered. Jessica hugged her back, smiling. "You earned this, Claire. You just needed someone to see it." As Claire walked toward her new future, Jessica felt Ethan's arm slide around her waist. "You really like proving people wrong, don't you?" he murmured. She smirked. "It's kind of my thing." He kissed the top of her head. "Remind me never to underestimate you again." She turned in his arms, looking up at him. "Oh, Ethan, you never stood a chance." And as he laughed and pulled her closer, Jessica knew this wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of something even better,